some other people. Oh,
Hmm.
so give it a couple more minutes and then we'll start things off.
I see that recording has started, so all of us are now on the and I'm sure Henry, who is manning the AREAA Boston account, will be starting Facebook Live shortly. And then Henry, if you could spotlight Sam and I as the speakers, and then at your cue, we'll get kicked off.
And whenever you guys are ready.
All right, we'll get
Sure.
started. Greeting on behalf of AREAA Boston. I'm Michael Chase, a member of the Commercial Committee, and we thank you for joining us for today's conversation. We'd like to start off by thanking our Commercial Committee sponsors, RCN Capital, Pear Corporation, and Northmark. And also thank you to the AREAA Boston Board and AREAA community for helping to host today's program. A few housekeeping items. Please place yourself on mute during our discussion, but feel free to enter any questions in the chat. We'll try to check in every now and then, but also leave time at the end for some Q&A. So with that, let's get started. We are very pleased to be joined by Sam Park of Sam Park and Company. Sam, thank you for accepting our invitation to speak with us today. Before we dive in, how about we start off with a quick introduction? Would you mind sharing a bit about yourself?
Sure. As you can tell by the video, I'm Asian. I'm Korean, but more importantly, I'm a real estate developer here in the Boston area. I used to own I like to consider a relatively large engineering firm 20 years, some years back, and found a lot of skill sets translated very well over to real estate. We do primarily entertainment, retail, mixed use developments. Currently own maybe about 1 million square feet of projects in the Boston metro area. And perhaps the other thing worth noting is we've also, for some of the expertise we bring, we've been advisors to some of our colleagues on some large scale projects, ranging from the Polaroid redevelopment outside of Boston to projects for the Craft Organization, Boston University, even our former president, Donald Trump, in terms of years ago, having worked on his Atlantic City casinos. So that's it. Graduate of Columbia University, 4 daughters. So still have to work a little bit.
4 daughters, so there's an achievement in and of itself.
That's development.
Yeah. Well, you've certainly had an extensive career, and I know by knowing you, you're being modest, and we haven't even scratched the surface of everything you've been involved in. Is there a particularly notable project for you?
Well, it's interesting. My career has really spanned 2 or 3 different phases, actually. I've been a long believer that careers are meant to last 20 years, and then you move on to something new. Perhaps the most notable projects that I think provide the most relevant experience are actually some of the ones that we're working on now. Our company primarily specializes in, and it may be relevant to some of your viewership. We tend to be that group that kind of goes between big capital and mom and pop capital. The ability to we found a lot of large scale projects are actually owned by mom and pop type owners who don't have the capital to bring them to the institutional quality assets that they have for the potential of being. And so we basically fill that gap by bringing in capital, some expertise, and probably a willingness to work with landowners as well as smaller investors to basically make big projects happen. So, a good example very recently is, our Point project, which is right outside of the IBM's former headquarters on 495. We bought an apple orchard from a group and ended up, because of my background in engineering and environmental permitting, we knew what we could get built, but long before most people knew what they thought could get built. And we actually crafted the zoning and the legislation to get this project approved. Turned out that it supports about 500,000 square feet on roughly 80 acres. As well as some environmental awards for our restoration of wetlands and what have you. But the project was interesting in that it has retail, cinemas, a host of restaurants, a Marriott hotel, and we still have 3 more buildings to build, which we will do at this point, slightly derailed by the COVID pandemic, as I'm sure many of you have found, put a little crimp in people's design flow, development flow. But that one's kind of sums up what we do as a company.
Yeah, you mentioned, I mean, that was built out in phases, certainly, and you mentioned part of that you were trying to lease up as COVID hit. What were some of the other challenges or successes involved in that project?
Well, it's good. Good question. Quite honestly, the biggest challenge we face today, it used to be like permits was the big challenge in Massachusetts. It used to be a state of just saying no. No matter what you wanted to build, someone would say no. It's changed, I think, in the last 10 years. It's become dramatically more economic friendly, long as you're sensitive to some of the things like the environmental issues that you face. But the real challenge that has hit us is the unpredictability of the economy. In the olden days, I'm not, I don't want to date myself, but it used to be the black swan events, as they say, hit Wall Street every 20 years, maybe every 50 years, or, we've had 2 or 3 of them in the last decade, starting with 2008, the downfall of, Shearson Lehman, really roiled the banking environment. Then followed by, the hiccup in real estate in the, mid, 20, early, just after that, maybe 2015. And then now COVID really hit us hard in 2000. I guess when is like getting 2020, 2021. A good example is, we had 1 million square feet of retail that had just opened. We had just started and pulled a contract for building our 3rd project, which is now resumed as of yesterday, literally 30 days before Governor Baker shut the economy down. So you go from having, millions of dollars of rent flow, to zero. And that's a black swan that no one can predict, no one can underwrite. And I guess that's probably the biggest challenge, is that these unpredictable economic events seem to be impacting us much more frequently than maybe it had 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The other one is infrastructure. The biggest challenge we face on that is it used to be traffic. Everyone was worried about traffic. Some, for better or worse, no longer just traffic. It is now equally power, water, sewer. And those constraints actually are bigger inhibitors to major growth than, the ability to add a traffic light or add a lane. And finally, I think the unpredictability of the debt markets. And Mike, you probably know this much better than me, but in the last 10 years, we've seen the ability to finance projects dramatically change from time to time, just because of the equity requirements, the debt coverage ratios, the financeability of projects, and what at times has been a very low interest environment has become a much more competitive or much more difficult environment to finance these days. And that's relatively recent. That's in the last 24 months. So I guess that, in the lion's share, the best way to address those challenges we found is maintaining relationships. We were lucky to survive the COVID downturn when we, literally had 0 rent coming in for 6 months because we had great banking relationships. Because we never screwed any of our investors or our lenders, and so they're also willing to stand behind us. Sorry, that's probably not a word I should use on a video screen, but it kind of shows you that the importance of organizations like AREAA, whatever, to basically create relationships is really important, especially in a parochial region of the country like New England. If we didn't have good relationships, we probably would have been, shown the door to most of our projects within the 30 days. But in reality, we ended up working out every loan that we had with our lenders because of the fact that we'd been in business for 20 years. And all our assets were performing, but for COVID.
Right. The cornerstone of any real estate is, of course, location, location, location. But in commercial real estate, relationships are so key. Again, we invite anybody to please feel free to enter any questions in the Q&A as we go along. But Sam, let me kind of take this conversation in a slightly different direction. You mentioned earlier, of course, you are Asian. How do you feel being Asian has either influenced or affected your professional experience?
This may not go over well for everyone on this call, but I found that it's less about me being Asian than about maybe some of the things my Asian dad taught me when I was growing up. I am first generation. My dad immigrated from Korea back in the 50s, right after the war. He had a really hard time, adapting to different cultures and different, I guess, social drivers. And so what I found that helpful in is it forced me to actually be able to go outside of my norm or out of my familiar zone and learn to adapt, to understand the differences, the different perspectives, the different cultural issues. And so it makes you a better listener, I think. It also creates sort of this fear of, or this strength in overcoming the fear of doing something that hasn't been done before. I like to say that, my talent or our company's talent of turning, rocks into soup really comes from the fact that, my dad came to this country with rocks and, he made some soup out of it. And you kind of take a different perspective on every deal you look at. Whereas, 9 people before us thought, Littleton would never get built. It's been cursed by the American Indians back in the 1700s. We looked at it totally different. We looked at what can we make out of it, forget about what everyone else has said about it in the past. And, the ability to work with town officials, contractors, local residents, really, I think, benefits from my own upbringing of having to deal with different groups of people. So I guess it's not so much being Asian, but maybe my Asian upbringing has helped us. I will say that the more important than, and maybe this is a good reason to be part of organizations like AREAA, or if you belong to an organization, you quickly realize a lot of people are in, the same boat that you're in, right? You're all looking for relationships. You're all looking for contacts. You're looking for information real time. And the more people you know, and as many organizations as you can join, the better you are in competing. In the olden days, I think Boston was a very parochial, area of, Irish Americans, not to say anything bad about it, but it was a very parochial city. It's become very international over the last 2 decades. And so, and I don't find really, this is the part that people might not agree with. I don't find a lot of racism has affected me or prejudicial perspectives. But I have found that the ability to communicate and garner from other people's perspectives has greatly helped me to get through the gauntlet of permitting and the ability to raise financing, raise equity capital.
Great. Thank you for that perspective, Sam. I do see we had a couple of questions come in, so why don't we maybe shift over to those before we continue on. Question from Aaron. Do you see climate resiliency being scrutinized more by permitting authorities?
As of this month, yes. They just passed the stretch code in Massachusetts. And what that means is there's a lot of turmoil. The stretch code is going to make it much more difficult for builders. Good example is any new buildings are going to require electric-based heating and air conditioning versus what is the industry standard of gas-powered. Not that it's a bad thing, but it's going to be interpreted differently by every community and every building official. So I think there's going to be a year or two of just sort of digesting what these new stretch code requirements are. Already there's some give back in terms of the renovation of existing buildings. It doesn't necessarily have to stretch to do all of the HVAC compliance right away. But the need to greater to insulate buildings is becoming much more of an issue. And again, it's not so much even driven by the code as it is driven by pure how much power is available on the grid, how much water and sewer are available in the municipal systems. So the sustainability issue, I think, is a good a good thing for the industry, especially in residential, because it's going to make a huge dent. I think the interpretation of it for anyone building residential or commercial is going to have a challenge getting a straight answer from anybody at the state or in the local building department. And therefore, something that works in Waltham is not going to work in Littleton, and something that works in Littleton may not work on Cape Cod. So that would be, I would strongly suggest, as we're finding out today, real time, half our project in Tingsboro, which is just south of Nashua, is being redesigned to comply with the stretch code, while the other half is under construction and not being part of the stretch code. So there's some stuff that deals with that. But at the end of the day, I think it's all good stuff. It's building technology has changed, and frankly, things like solar panels, roof, electric, Tesla stations, and they're actually old hat. They're most of the developers I know are, all their buildings are compliant and capable of supporting roof generation, et cetera. So I think it'll be something we can tolerate, but it'll be a challenge understanding what is the right solution for the next maybe 24 months.
Great. And I see we have another question, which actually kind of blends with a question I was going to ask anyway. So maybe I'll make it a bit of a hybrid. Talking about your role and experience as being a developer, and also kind of in the context of the current market, particularly here in Boston, with some assets struggling, such as office. How do you go about identifying opportunities, or what development opportunities are you seeing potentially available today?
When I started this company 20 years ago, we started out as a land development company, really taking our engineering company's expertise and translating it over to real estate, realizing that a large part of the value creation was actually taking land, permitting it, and then we found it very easy to find financing to actually build the buildings. The challenges today, if you think about what makes a project feasible, there's several components. One is the market feasibility, financing feasibility, engineering feasibility, and permit feasibility. And so when you look at those four components, the market feasibility has definitely been shaken in the last couple of years. Office is greatly underutilized today. There's a lot of vacancy, primarily from the COVID change, and the next generation of people don't want to go to work; they want to work remotely. That's a paradigm shift that isn't going away. I think it will eventually resort back to you need office time. I think I kind of agree with most people. I would call it on my, I'm getting ready to retire, so I guess I'm at my age side. I think there's value add in being in the office at least 3 days a week, but we also, even for us, allow for remote. Zoom works great, right? But that's a paradigm shift that's happening. It's going to change how office is configured and what type of amenities people want in their office spaces. Retail, frankly, New England is over-retailed. If you were to look at the gap studies for this whole region, we have far more retail square footage than we have demand. And then if you look at residential, while people are still building, and there's some studies that say we're 20,000 units short still of sustainable growth, meaning there's a huge demand for residential. I personally find residential is highly valued, if not overvalued. So those are the three challenges that the three markets face. We were kind of fortunate. When we broke off and created our company, we didn't want to just do what everyone does, choose a sector and focus on it. We started off really thinking entertainment, retail, restaurants, basically the urbanism theme as our paradigm shift. I once presented to a group about the movement from the urbanization of suburb. There's no matter how you look at it, there's a huge desire line of people wanting to have the experience of being downtown, the restaurants, the pedestrian streetscapes, the granite curbs, the benches, the mixture of retail, office, and housing. And we thought that's a real shift. So, our focus has been bringing those elements outside of the city, basically moving them outside of 128 if you're from the Boston area, or outside the Beltway if you're in DC. So, and that shift actually materialized, started maybe at the turn of the millennia in 2000. And consequently, we find that our focus on having places to go, and that combine these uses seems to be very sustainable. Most of our centers have movie theaters, all of them have restaurants, some of them have grocery stores, but we're trying to get multi-trips, almost creating sort of exciting urban downtowns in the suburbs, which is kind of a paradox in itself. But likewise, it tends to benefit the office shift, the fact that people who want to work also want to play, people that want to live also want to eat, and people that want to eat also want to go see movies and play. I guess we just opened up 2 golf simulator companies. So there's that holistic approach to real estate leaves us a little different market segment than most developers who specialize in one or the other. Now, there are a lot of nuances that affect the merging of different uses, residential, office, and it's always great to see architects say just put the residential on top of the retail buildings. It's not quite that easy. Everything from power, sewer again, but also trash pickup. The sense of smells from restaurants, the notion that arcades will have noise that the elderly aren't going to like if it's right next to an assisted living facility. There's a lot of subtleties in the design that I think as people get more accustomed to, it'll become more common. But right now it's still kind of a unique angle towards real estate. So we haven't been as affected by the downturn other than the ability to kind of change the dials on what we're building. So in Littleton, for example, we have the movie and the restaurant components. All the restaurants do very, very well up there. We anchored it with a grocery store that drives a lot of what I'll call 9 to 5 traffic. And then we have one more phase of office development that is going in. It's anchored by Fidelity Investments and a few other medical office type uses. So you kind of create a 24/7 environment, which I think is important for sort of adhering to the urbanist approach to the suburbs. You can't have a place that looks like a ghost town 9 to 5 only to come alive for dinner traffic. You'll die economically. Likewise, you can't have a place that is so retail oriented that you aren't susceptible to a downturn in retail demand. So that's I would say that's the difference. But there are definitely differences, and I would definitely say it's a very challenging environment for anyone doing spot development of one use. If I were to give any advice, it would be make sure you're next to an area that has the demand. You want to be the gorilla in the room, not the small player, or at least next to the gorilla.
Very much like your Gloucester development, that whole live, work, play concept. And you may be planning it, but you don't necessarily have to do it all yourself. You can portion off sections. And I think you had Dolben as a partner and they did the apartment section, and you having a hotel developer take off a section. That's great. So
just to comment on that, Mike, it is important to know that all these uses are highly specialized. Housing is made on the margins. Some of the retail is very tied in with co-tenancy and retail leasing requirements. So, we've always found that being a healthy part of a healthy project is better than owning the whole thing and failing miserably on something that you've never done before. So in Gloucester, for example, it's somewhat of a seasonal market, but we did notice that there was the demographics showed that people had nowhere to shop, nowhere to play, and et cetera. So we ended up building a project that includes 200 housing units, a brand new YMCA that supports the whole North Shore, and our retail thing, along with a Market Basket grocery anchored center. And it's doing phenomenally well. The housing units sold out, and the feedback has been, it's because there's places to go besides just suburbia. The YMCA is drawing an enormous amount of traffic. And then our retail does very well. We've still been able to land stores that other people are finding very difficult. The Home Goods, the Marshalls, the Market Baskets. And it's taken us 10 years to get to the stage with that project. But again, it's because of long-term capital, the willingness of our lenders to stand behind us during thick or thin. I mean, I seem to, whenever I start a new project, it seems the black swan lands. In 2008, we started Gloucester Crossing. We closed on our loan literally 2 weeks before Lehman spit the bit. Ended up having to fight through construction that was underway, knowing that one of our anchor retailers and one of our hotels spit the bit. But we weathered through it. And then when we are now starting Tingsboro in 2019, we advertised the contract. 3 months or literally 3 weeks later, when we broke ground, the state shut down for 6 months, right? So I guess if you really want to play it safe, just watch when we do our next deal and get out of the market before we start. But it's if you haven't planned well and you can weather the storm of an extended downturn, you'll do okay. Time has a way of healing all wounds in real estate.
Yeah, incredible examples of your resiliency. But yeah,
It's partly the mixed use. I mean, Dolben is a great housing developer. He's done far more units than I could ever imagine. I think he may be one of the largest residential. He's got the staying power to go through the thick and thin. And some of the unexpecteds in new development are very challenging. The cost of asbestos abatement if you're buying an existing building that may not be recognized when you start demo. So, for us to have given away the housing component and the YMCA component, in our mind, gave away the downside risk of building something we are not really qualified to build. Likewise, it brought to our center all the things we want in our center, which are the different uses, the housing, 60,000 square foot, I think they must have spent close to $30 million on that YMCA. And it's made all of our retailers do better, and we're really benefiting from the upturn in rental rates.
Great. One of the questions we had from our Facebook Live audience is, what have you been seeing or what have you been seeing or expecting the vacant office spaces to be converted to?
That's a great question. I think people have been trying to figure that out for about 20 years, since 2008. There is clearly a move towards more, I would call it open officing, where the space requirement per an employee, which used to be around 300 square feet per employee, has dropped to 150 to 200 square feet per employee, both because of the, I wouldn't call it the WeWorks model, but because of the more open office concept brought by the tech companies. But that demand has been largely fulfilled. Currently, it's a little bit of a challenge. The footprints for the reason it's such a challenge to convert to other uses is ceiling heights don't work for retail, building depths don't work for residential, and a typical office building might be 90 to 100 feet deep. It's just too wide to have the fenestration for residential. So I think there's a lot of testing of what can happen. I think some residential conversion works in very specific buildings, but you really have to understand how residential, wants to operate and how you're going to lay the units out. I think the other thing that, so I think you're going to find a huge flight to quality because of the downturn in the office market. I think people who used to only be able to afford Class B, Class C suburban office space are finding that they can find Class A and Class B real estate at the same price point, which means there probably won't be a lot of new construction except for those uses that can afford the recent bump in construction costs. That's primarily biotech, life sciences, at least in this area. Where the biotech challenge has been historically that the cost to build out is huge. It's probably more expensive to do the build out than it is to do the building. So consequently, you're finding only people who can get credit tenants and major institutions to take space can actually afford to do it, other than maybe some of the leading edge research people that are backed by what are basically companies like Alexandria or firms that are able to offer incubator space. So I guess the answer to the question is I'm not sure what you do with the masses of industrial space. We converted the warehouse for Polaroid on 128 to Clark's Shoe Company. The building was very old, very tired, pretty fatigued in terms of structures because it was built in the post-war era. However, if you look at an old Polaroid building, and if you happen just to know that they were designed to be blast-proof in case of a bomb run, they were explosion. You can be half the structural capacity and still exceed today's office loads because the buildings were built so strong back in the 60s and 50s. But most part, it's very hard to convert because of office height ceilings have changed. It used to be that an 8-foot ceiling was a very doable office. You'll see this in Boston quite a lot. And on the other hand, most office space wants to have a minimum of a 9-foot, 9.5-foot clear to the underside of the suspended ceilings. So I think you'll find that a lot of conversions look great conceptually, and every planner in every town thinks that's the great use to convert it. But when you get into the actual nuts and bolts of it, I would bet, forgive me, I would bet most of them are economically not viable because the cost of taking it down almost is comparable to the cost of putting it up.
So we talked a little bit about office, Sam, but you have certainly done a number of retail developments or mixed use that included a considerable amount of retail. Do you see any trends here in the future of retail?
I think it's, I think the biggest challenge I think you'll find also, same with the office, is that the malls are going to have a big reinvention period. They need to, the cost of heating, cooling, and securing, indoor malls has become so cost prohibitive that, a lot of retailers are opting to open space, the outdoor centers. And that trend started 15 years ago, 20 years ago, where they're finding that it's very hard to compete with online, and unless you're very cost competitive. And to be cost competitive, it's very hard to compete when you have to air condition, heat, and pay for security guards and escalators 24/7. There are no really great uses for old malls other than, they're starting to find like when a mall can convert to a warehouse, and when a mall can convert to a Lifetime Fitness as it did in Newton, you're starting to realize that, there's a huge drop in value in these malls. And if you look at the price points for a lot of these acquisitions, they all seem to be a really big bargain now. And those that are starting to come up vacant. On the other hand, they're very expensive to redo, and the users that are moving in are clearly a different mix. And we looked at one down in Jones Beach in New York. We actually looked at putting up a convention center and taking down the 2 anchors at some point, with a convention center themed, almost amusement park type development that would be surrounded by retail. So getting the draws there is getting harder and harder because of a lot of the online shopping and the mall premiums aren't there. And the CAM and real estate taxes are so high that you won't get retailers to go to them. Now, there's other people that will disagree with that. But I think if you look at the overall shift, there could be a lot of vacant space available in malls, as there has been for the last 10 years. And so the uses that I've seen that have successfully driven it are conversions to medical office, conversions to, believe it or not, I think Amazon has taken on some malls as their new distribution facilities. But the industrial rents are nowhere near what the historical retail rents have been. So the ability to support a new development at an industrial rate clearly shows that the value was lost, back 10 years ago when the anchors all dried up. So I'd be cautious. I know a lot of malls are trying to invert themselves. Malls that historically had been fashion anchored are starting to bring in things like hardware and grocery, just because those are the large space tenants that are still viable in communities that have that kind of space need.
Great.
But a challenge.
And so a follow-up question from Seth came in. Have you seen municipality willingness to approve variances needed for master plan or multi-use properties? How have you seen municipalities' willingness to approve those multi-use properties? And any tips to know in advance for a potential project?
Yeah, I think there's a general, it's a lot easier today to get towns smart about urbanizing developments. You know, a good example is on all of our projects, we almost never comply with one zoning. You know, the olden zoning codes were very use specific. And when you do a mixed use project, you're not really residential, you're not really commercial retail, you're really not office. So things like setbacks and zone requirements of heights just change, and they're to make a project feasible. On the other hand, I think communities today can appreciate that some of these zoning modifications make a better project. You know, for example, in Littleton, we have zero setback, which allowed us to get rid of all the, if you look at a lot of the old developments, you would have, you know, a building, an anchor building surrounded, you know, by 20 feet of open space, which turns out to be kind of a naked corner of the building. You know, the sidewalls are not very attractive. Littleton gave us zero setback so we could connect the next building directly to it. So you don't see the dog side, you know, I was going to say dog shit side of the building. You instead see the really attractive retail frontage. So I think communities, but they need to be explained. So I would say if my tip would be, if you're going into a community that finds, you know, that it has some very historic codes, you want to make sure you agree with the goals and objectives. Everyone wants walkable frontage. Everyone wants attractive development. Everyone likes to balance, you know, the retail tax base and jobs with residential, you know, loads. So as long as you can explain that to people, I think most communities are eager to do that. The difficulty in Massachusetts and some of the New England states is some of the zoning codes are very parochial to the town. Some zoning codes can't just be approved, they have to be approved by town meeting, and that becomes challenging. So, you know, it's always best to make sure that you have the support of the local officials, that they will endorse a zoning code change before you spend too much money, you know, coming up with great design plans. But once we found them very receptive. You know, in Tingsboro, we gave them like 5 things that we thought we needed, and it's all under the idea, the premise that we wanted very walkable and pedestrian friendly environments. And Tingsboro was kind of different. We had started with a 1,000-foot long strip retail building that was built in the 80s, and it just looked like a long strip center that you find uniformly across America. We've actually decided to break down that building into 6 buildings so that we could have end caps, as they call them, with glass on all sides of them, and little pedestrian areas, fire pits, benches. In Tingsboro and Littleton, it was the opposite problem. It was they had a zoning code that required 50-foot setbacks from every adjacent building. We convinced them that a zero setback works to their advantage because it allows us to create more attractive spaces, allows us to hide the sidewalls of buildings, and really forces people to walk along the pedestrian edge of an urban environment. And in both communities, while dramatically different, are communities that saw the value in that and were able to, get behind a zoning change.
Right. So Sam, we've talked about a lot of what you've done in your experiences, but kind of thinking back to when you first started, do you have 1 or 2 suggestions for someone who's either looking to get started in CRE or looking to get started in development?
What was the first one? Getting started in
commercial real estate.
Oh, gotcha. Again, I think there's 4 aspects of commercial real estate, between the permit fees, and it really depends on which perspective you're coming from. If you're coming right out of school, or if you're coming as sort of a industry, transfer. Myself, I was an engineer. I considered myself to have a pretty successful engineering company. So we approached everything from a land emphasis. Knew very little about leasing, financing, and but knew a lot about engineering and environmental permitting. So that's really the approach we came in. We brought in the right consultants, the right expertise to help us, with our financing. We still don't quite understand what you do, Mike, so therefore we leave it to you to raise all our capital. But there's, I would say that the biggest challenge is you have to go in wide-eyed that the industry has 4 or 5 components, almost to the extent that in commercial real estate or development, there's really like you're a conductor, and you might be able to play the violin or you might be able to play the oboe, but to really make a good, a good performance, you need to be able to understand and have the right players on board. So making sure you're teamed up with everyone that fills your gaps is absolutely critical, because it only takes one bad mistake to make up for 10 great mistakes, or destroy 10, the benefit of 10 great decisions. And it's probably about that ratio. So avoiding mistakes is the, I guess, the name of the game.
Or the big mistake.
Yeah, even little mistakes can become big mistakes very quickly. Little things like you build something, you realize, you forgot about, you can't rebuild it. At that point, the cost basis is in and you're stuck. But I do think bringing on board, the other thing when you first start, if you're coming straight out of school, I think is to really kind of take advantage of your natural aptitude. There's nothing wrong with being an engineer in real estate. There's nothing wrong with being a lawyer in real estate. There's nothing wrong with being an architect or a broker or a salesman. Just knowing that there's other attributes of the business that are equally important is probably the most important thing you can do.
Great advice. So kind of taking it back to something you mentioned a little earlier, Seth had a question. Any suggestions on how to leverage the increased occurrence of black swan events? Do you see an appetite from investors for any lower returns to build in added layers of resilience to properties?
That's a really good question. I've had a longstanding belief, although I don't know if it's ever been tested. Maybe your Facebook audience can do this, but it seems to me that the financial markets, if you look at what we call a capital stack, which is everything from sponsorship equity to institutional equity to the mezzanine debt to the senior debt, each of those stacks are priced differently. But at the end of the day, it almost always comes out to about the same total percentage of the deal or rate. Barring the recent jump of 2 to 3 points in financing costs, I gotta believe equity capital needs to adjust its expectations because the deals just don't pencil out anymore. And what I mean by that is equity capital, because lenders are now loaning less of the stack, means equity capital has to put in a greater portion of the financing. And so either you have really long-term patient capital equity, or you have to expect a lower expectation on your return, or you are just sitting on the sidelines. I don't think anyone wants to sit on the sidelines right now. I still see there is deals to be done. And I even see lenders willing to come off of the expected interest rates in order to lock in longer term debt structures, with the belief that interest rates will stabilize and start to come back down again. So I guess the answer to the question is, I definitely think we will buy into some security. One of the reasons we phase projects, Mike, frankly, is the way we phase projects, we can stop a project at any moment in time, and each phase is independently financed. And while it's a little bit of a brain damage to keep it all, together, it's very insulated from major shifts in both equity or financing markets. We don't need to refinance an entire $100 million deal. We're refinancing as time goes $20 million components of that deal. And I used to joke that, Mike makes more than I do because he gets paid 4 times the refinance of my projects every 3 years. But we constantly roll with the economy. Oh yeah, I'll keep that secret. But we're glad to pay because there's a lot of brain damage, frankly, the way we finance projects, as Michael will attest to. But because we phase it, every phase has its own equity requirement, which is very manageable. So the other thing that we've done that is probably different than most developers is we guarantee our debt. So in this kind of questionable market, most developers, even the major players, do not like to sign personal guarantees. On the other hand, for us, our projects are at that manageable phased scale that we're comfortable doing that, with the belief that we've somewhat insured ourselves against, calamity, because we have good projects and maybe we have troubled projects, then the overall portfolio is pretty stable. That does buy us a lot of comfort with our lenders to be a little bit more aggressive on the lending, which means we need less equity capital. So if the total returns look better for us, but we are at risk. I do know a lot of developers who do it the other way, which is quite honestly the right way to do it, is to probably limit your personal guarantees. They are finding that equity and, people are looking to be more conservative, make sure that they can exit, make sure they're not susceptible to swap breakage or anything like that this day in market. But Mike, you may know better than I do, but it seems to me that there is definitely a lower return expectation if you can show them that there is a more conservative underwriting. Cash flow is king. If you can show them that you can hit the debt coverage come hell or high water, they're going to be much more comfortable than you trying to explain that it's a 4x return on their money over 3 years. I think they're looking more at the cash flow than they are at the home run. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's definitely a change since last 24 months.
Yeah, we're seeing that too, Sam, kind of reversion of fundamentals. So a focus more on cash flow versus cap rate compression. So Sam, thank you for taking the time today.
Sure.
And as we wrap up, we always like to ask our guests, what can AREAA Boston do for you?
I think just given where I am in my stage of life, I might put it the other way. I'm happy to help out any of your new members. If there's people that have interest in learning more about what we do, I'm happy to share that knowledge. So that I think is not to spin it on you, Mike, but when you get to the age of over 60, you start to think about how you pass on the knowledge. So that would be, if there's something you can do, send me some young people that would like to learn the business, and we'll help teach it to them.
Great, the opportunity to provide mentorship. There you go.
Yeah.
Well, we're kind of nearing kind of that last quarter of the hour, so I'd like to open it up to our guests and participants now. Please feel free to turn on your cameras, unmute yourself, and let's open up for some quick Q&A while we still have Sam for the next 10 minutes or so. Would anybody like to start off?
I'll just say, well, thank you, Michael and Sam, for having this chat. Sam, for your insights. As an engineer in the real estate, early engineer, in the real estate community, it's always interesting to see how these projects, both from a rural, suburban, and urban environment get permitted. From your perspective, what you're seeing from the owner developer side, are you seeing more of the transit oriented developments? You mentioned walkability and some of those features that municipalities and other authorities are kind of having jurisdiction or looking at. Are there other features that you see municipalities also bringing to the table and asking developers and their designers to look at, for instance, building facades and how the buildings are situated on the properties, landscaping design for stormwater purposes, that sort of thing?
TOD, or transit-oriented development, is big and probably going to get bigger, especially relative to residential. The administration passed some recent legislation. Now, unfortunately, we don't emphasize residential. We would bring in a partner to do most of that. But every community is going to be obligated to designate a by right TOD zoning area that allows high density housing if it's accessible to trains and transit. So that's a paradigm shift. And there's that ties a community's state funding to that program. I think what is missing for sort of that would be very beneficial for communities is if the state had a buying expertise to review facades, pedestrian streetscape. It's a design element in the literal sense of like art, as opposed to the science of engineering. And what I mean by that is not all communities have the wherewithal to hire a really great review team to say you could do it this way to make it a stronger, more attractive development. So you get a lot of hit and misses, quite frankly, in the suburbs. Boston, overkill with planners and designers that will run your project through the gauntlet. But you almost know it's almost whatever the developer says in a suburb, most communities will either believe it or their review will be based on more the technical aspects. So I think it's really important. We actually, when we start projects, we might spend the first year doing conceptual studies that maybe the BRA would do, for example, for a project in Boston, because we are so dependent on the pedestrian streetscape and how we make this a different mousetrap for retail and customers. So I think you can't sell yourself short on good design. You may not get there, and be able to build everything you want to build, but to have a little visioning exercise in your upfront of your project, I think is always important if you want to distinguish your project. Because it absolutely makes a difference. If you turn out to be just another, aluminum sided, housing suburban development, you will find it's very difficult to distinguish yourself in the market when the tide turns. If on the other hand, you spend a little extra, it's relatively small money, but if you spend that extra bit, making sure your streetscape is well thought out, you have the right amount of pedestrian areas, a $10,000 fire pit is a great investment. Now I'm waiting for the sustainability people to say, we're burning fossil fuel 8 hours a day, but it creates that amenity that people want. And most communities and most developers don't know that that's what people want. So I would say that's a key thing. I don't know if that answered the question or not, but it's definitely is a challenge.
No, it did. Thank you.
And I see Seth has his hand raised. Seth, you have a question.
Absolutely. Sam, so glad. I really appreciate what you were just sharing there on that, kind of putting the effort in up front. And I'm curious to hear a little if you have any structured format or how you go about that design charrette,
Sure.
conceptual studies. I know it can be a little bit of a messy community who gets involved. You kind of want to put some parameters up because if you have too many talking heads in a room, and on that note, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself.
That's a great question because, to do Littleton, which is their biggest project, I think we're the biggest taxpayer in Kingsborough and in Littleton and in Gloucester because the projects we've brought to communities have traditionally been adverse to development. But we actually started with when we bought the properties, we actually started with a visioning exercise with the town. And we actually said, what do you want? And we explained to them that we're interested in doing a project if the town's interested in doing it. So we talked through how they wanted, in Littleton, for example, a village scale, but techie based, development that was very walkable. They wanted gable roofs. Not always, not every community wants that. And those elements. And so we had a design team literally working, with t-shirts and shorts and just walking around with the town officials and really understanding what they wanted to do. And then we strategized a bit on how we would present a plan or several plans. And I will say that the choice is very important for communities. So the ability to give them 2 or 3 ideas, maybe a couple of them are a little biased, so you kind of lead them to the right answer. But the ability to give them choices of what things can happen really opens their eyes up very quickly. And then you go into the detail of, okay, what zoning changes do we need? And in Littleton's case, we need 0 setback. Another good example, Littleton has a town bylaw that says 60,000 square feet per lot, right? So we have 540,000 square feet. And oftentimes people wonder how we did that. We have 7 lots or 8 lots. So there's each having 60,000. So laying out the building so that no more than 60,000 square feet of retail exists on any given lot was part of the challenge, and it resulted in 0 lot setback, and what have you. Our approach to the upfront stuff really is usually a 6-month, open slate master plan. Now we have, having done a lot of planning for a lot of major projects myself, I have one edge up on a lot of developers that a lot of this stuff is done in-house with. I'm probably the only developer that has, a box of trace paper in my office. So we will sketch and resketch and drive everyone crazy for about 6 months until we say, let's go. So going through that process gives us an idea of all the potentials of what could be there as opposed to what is there. After that point, we'll hopefully zero the town into figuring out what is financially feasible that overlaps with what they'd like to see happen. It could be everything from they want, some of the stuff's pretty straightforward. Everyone loves to have a walkable, attractive development, even if it's traffic generating. But it takes you a little time to get them to that answer. And then what we do is what we call a PDA, preliminary development analysis. And in that analysis, we can pretty quickly, probably within that same time frame, assess the market, assess the financeability, the construction costs, and the permit requirements. And as long as we get to a point where we're comfortable, has enough leeway to give back a little, then we go to the town really with the philosophy that we're happy with 80% of what we deserve. And what I mean by that is because we're long-term landowners and long-term, we don't usually sell. And so we can hold things. We found that whereas most people in this profession, if not in the world of finance, want 120% of what they deserve, us looking for 80% of what we deserve means we have 20% of goodwill from the get-go. So, if there is, the ability to give a little bit more in terms of walkways, we usually do it very willingly, and that buys an enormous amount of goodwill with the communities. We do have to deliver on it. So, it's not for free, but it buys you an enormous amount of ability to get through the gauntlet of permitting, especially in New England. So, the ability to support, local causes. We also do that just as a corporate tithing anyway. I don't know, Mike, if you know, but we give away 10% of all our corporate earnings to children's educational programs. It's just a sort of a requirement of ours. So that leaves us with only 10% left to give back to the town. But it's, having that philosophy, you can make up 20% short if you're a long-term holder. If you're strictly on the sort of turn and burn, develop and sell, you probably can't. So you might have to play a little bit more as of right, hard knocks. But, if you called any of the towns we've developed in, I think most of them tell you we've honored every commitment, and we're actually viewed as an asset, not a problem for the town. But, and we enjoy it. I know most of the neighbors in Gloucester personally. It's a little bit difficult when there's a windstorm up there and everyone's asking why our trash is floating around the street, but I'll get calls myself on my cell phone on Sundays, which I'd like to get rid of, but that's the cost of poker, I guess. In Tingsboro, we know most of the neighbors up there. We know all of our tenants, and building good tenant relationships is equally important as building good neighborhood relationships, because things happen. We've worked with every tenant during COVID to make sure that none of them went bankrupt. And any advantages we got from lender relief, we passed on directly to our tenants to make sure that long term our developments stayed filled.
Wow. Thank you, Sam. So many golden nuggets. And I guess a kind of a key takeaway I'm hearing from you, and this is what can really change the mindset of developer. The word developer can be seen as a 4-letter word without,
Oh, absolutely.
And I just love how, if, instead of looking at the town as the enemy, going and actually asking the town what they want. And right, it's like it's like the essence of Dale Carnegie, right? Good. If you give somebody what they want, they're going to say, how soon can you deliver this for me, Mr. Park? Thank you. I so appreciate that you're So, and I appreciate the inclusion of the Y. My mom was a 30-year Y employee in Greenfield, and I know how tight those finances can be, but it also created a hub of activity that a lot of neighboring and adjacent businesses. I can now picture that just a ton of things were supported by having a humming community center. So thank you for your contributions there, and just a healthy perspective on development that we want stuff, we want nice places, and yeah, it's just a great process. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I know when I look at Sam's numbers, most people, you have to scrutinize the developer profit. I always have to look for the beer and burger line item and figure out what to do with that. But Sam, thank you for taking the time to chat with us
You're
today.
very welcome.
To our audience and people who have joined us both here on Zoom and on Facebook Live, thank you for joining us today. We have more great programs coming, so please feel free to follow AREAA Boston on LinkedIn and other social media platforms. Once again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.